The second dimension Smart describes is the mythological dimension. In everyday English, we use the term myth to mean something that is not true. In religious studies, when we call something a myth, we make no such value judgment. Myth does not mean false, but rather story. The mythological dimension encompasses the collection of stories, images, or myths, through which the invisible world is symbolized. Almost every religion has a creation myth. Myths include stories about the gods, but also the important stories in the history of the religion. For instance, in Judaism, the myth of the Exodus is one of the most important stories of the history of Judaism, because it tells of a time when God called a people out of slavery and delivered them into a promised land. It reminds Jews that they were once exploited and downtrodden, and tells of God's deliverance, mercy, provision, and providence. Myths are sources of poetic and imagistic power. They encode important meanings for religious practitioners. But we need to be careful when we look at the myths of other religions, for their meanings are not always immediately obvious. We often need an insider to interpret the myth for us to truly understand what it means and how it functions in the religion. For example, in Hinduism, there is a popular myth about Lord Krishna. When Krishna was a young man, he was quite mischievous, with a weakness for young, beautiful ladies. There was once a group of young cow-herding women. They went to bathe in the Jumna River, and naturally left their clothes on the banks. Krishna stole their clothes and hid in a tree. He refused to give the clothes back until they, each one of the women, had come out singly, one by one, with their hands clasped in an attitude of prayer. What are we to do with this myth? Frankly, it sounds horrifying. Krishna seems to be taking advantage of these vulnerable young women, coercing them into putting a show on for him. Is this story endorsing the sexual coercion of women by men? That's kind of what it looks like on the surface. In truth, this myth is often used as an allegory of the relationship between the soul and God. But who's God and who is the soul? The soul is Krishna, surprisingly enough. God is represented in the beautiful young maidens, and the story tells us that the soul is like Krishna, seeking out and enraptured by the beauty of God. The myths of religion are often like this. They do not mean what they appear to mean on the surface. The third dimension that Smart discusses is the doctrinal dimension. I've already said something about the doctrinal dimension, so I'll be brief here. As we said before, doctrines are an attempt to give system, clarity, and intellectual power to what is revealed through the mythological and symbolic language of religious faith and ritual. Doctrine is often about myth, so this can be hard to distinguish clearly. But as we saw in the myth of Krishna and the cow-herding maidens, there's a clear difference between the story and the teaching about the story. In Christianity, there's the myth of the virgin birth. Mary is supposed to have given birth to Jesus as a virgin, which is a complete miracle, since this is impossible according to the natural order of things. The doctrines of the virgin birth tell us about the meaning and significance intellectually of the virgin birth. All Christians profess faith in the virgin birth, but Catholic Christianity has an elaborate set of doctrines about Mary related to her virginity, her perpetual virginity, and the meaning of her virginity for laypersons. These doctrines are an intrinsic part of Mariology. Theology is the study of the doctrines of religion. While it's quite natural to describe one's attitude to the doctrines of religion as a matter of belief, as the Durham's definition of religion points out, you can see the Durham's definition of religion in the multimedia provided for week 1, it is probably more appropriate to think of the religious person's attitude towards doctrines as one of commitment. Rather than believing the doctrinal teachings of religion, one is committed to them and one accepts them. The next dimension is the ethical dimension. The ethical dimension describes the rules and norms of behavior that religion gives for human society. The ethical dimension is prescriptive. That is, it tells us what we ought to do and how we ought to organize ourselves and act towards others. These others can include animals, humans, and the gods. One of the most important ethical precepts of Christianity is to love thy neighbor as thyself. Jesus famously summed up all of the law and the prophets, that is, the whole of the Jewish scriptures, as love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself. This is at the heart of the ethical dimension of Christianity. In Buddhism, there's a strong guiding principle of compassion for all sentient beings. This means that it's forbidden to take life in any form. The Buddhist should not kill anything that is living, human or non-human. The ethical dimension, as should be evident from what I've said, is highly idealistic. The ethics of religion often sets very high standards, standards that are difficult to meet. Obviously, not every Christian meets the commandment to love her neighbor as herself. And there are Buddhists who are fishermen. They clearly don't meet the requirement not to kill anything sentient. We can think of the social dimension as related to the ethical dimension because ethics tells us how society ought to function and be organized, but the social dimension tells us how society under the influence of a given religion actually functions. Because the ideals of religion are often very difficult to meet, religions often adapt themselves to certain human realities. Describing how society actually functions, as distinct from the ideal of how it should function, expresses the social dimension, which we turn to now. The social dimension describes how the ethical dimension gets translated into the concrete, lived society. The way the institutionalized teachings of a religion make an impact on the shape and organization of society. A well-known aspect of the social dimension of Hinduism is the caste system. The caste system is a system of social hierarchy that traditionally, at least, determined its members' profession, their social status, and their social duties to persons of other castes. In Buddhism, the distinction between the social roles of monks and lay people is a part of the social dimension. In Buddhism, the role of the monk is to provide the lay person with what we might call spiritual food and spiritual guidance, while the role of the lay person is to provide the monks with physical food and monetary provision through alms. Buddhism organizes society into monks and laypersons. Can you think of a way in which Christianity shapes American society? How does Christianity influence politics and the social organization in America? You might want to pause here to ponder this question. Have you ever seen the president sworn into office? He swears on a Christian Bible. Has that ever struck you as strange? Have you ever seen the opening session of Congress? By no means are all congressmen and women Christians, but there's a prayer in the opening session. At a more abstract level, the Protestant Christian belief in what Martin Luther called the priesthood of all believers has had an enormous effect on American and European culture. The doctrine of the priesthood of all believers meant that all people had equal access to God. All people were equally priests, and therefore there was no need for a special class of super Christians, the priests and the monks, to intercede before God to make sure God heard us. This doctrine had profound effects on the belief in the equality of all people. While American society is, as a matter of fact, shaped by social hierarchies of wealth and power and race, Americans aspire to have everyone be equals. This is due, at least in part, to the radical shaping influence of a Christian past. Let's turn now to the experiential dimension. This is quite possibly the most difficult to define and identify, and to speak about, because often the experiences that religious believers seek are beyond words. Smart defines the experiential dimension as the entirety of, quote, the inner dimension of religion. Remember how there's an inner dimension to ritual? We talked about that previously. This means that there is an experiential dimension contained within the ritual dimension. These categories are not distinct. They are very interconnected. The experiential dimension includes the personal experience of connection to the divine, the experience of transcending the ever-changing world of suffering, and all of the aspirations to the transformative mystical experiences that the great founders of the world's religions reported as inspiring their change of heart and newfound sense of mission. The experiential dimension is by definition subjective. It's about experience. But we can speak about the experiential dimension because each of the religions has a distinct idea of what the religious believer should expect to experience when they experience the divine, or the absolute, as the case may be. What distinguishes religious experience from experience in general? This is a difficult question, especially since many persons of faith profess to find the divine suffused throughout their everyday experience. As a matter of fact, this is the aspiration of many persons of faith, that is, to see the divine everywhere. Still, Smart distinguishes religious experience from experience in general by saying that, quote, a religious experience involves some kind of perception of the invisible world, or involves a perception that some visible person or thing is a manifestation of the invisible world. This concludes this week's lecture on Smart's 6 dimensions of religion. But it should just be the beginning of your thinking about these various dimensions. Using these dimensions as we go through the class to organize your thinking about each of the religions. Some questions you may find it interesting to ask and answer. 1. Does this religion give priority to one dimension over the others? Are all of the dimensions roughly equal in significance? Does one drop away? Can you identify elements from each dimension in every religion? For those of you who are religious, is there a dimension of religion that shapes your experience with religion, or makes you attracted to religion more than one of the others? For those of you who are not religious, is there a dimension of religion that you find particularly problematic? Looking at religion through its many dimensions will give us plenty to see and learn this semester. See you next week.